Hi, good evening. Thank you all for joining this evening. We're taking a look at, I think, one of the most fascinating sections in all of Chumash, the brachot that Ya'akov Avinu gives to the Shvatim, to his 12 sons, before he passes away. Just before this, he did give two brachot to his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Yosef, and therefore made them into two tribes, so that basically he had already made Yosef his heir and his Bechor, because the Bechor, the firstborn, with the birthright, gets a double portion, and that was already given away. But there's another beautiful bracha that has been reserved for Yehuda. And that's what we're looking at today. These are three of the four psukim that are in his bracha. We're going to focus on the third pasuk, but I want to start with the first two because there's famous material in those as well. The most famous is in the second pasuk, but let's begin at the beginning. Yehuda ata yoducha achecha. Yehuda, you will be acknowledged. Yoducha is like Hodu Lashem. It can mean thanksgiving, but it can also mean Ani Modeh, I acknowledge. So ultimately, Yehuda gets acknowledged as the leader. We've already seen this really three times already here in the stories toward the end of the book of Bereshit. The first time was not so nice, actually, when the brothers listened to him and they said, don't let him die in the pit. Let's sell him off. Ma betza, what's the profit in leaving him there? So he took the leadership role there. Later, he takes the leadership role in defending Binyamin when Yosef wants to accuse him of stealing the golden chalice. And then when they come down to Egypt, again, Yaakov sends Yehuda first. So there already has become an acknowledgement that Yehuda is, even though not the Bechor. Remember, the blessing of the Bechor already went to Yosef. But there is an acknowledgement that Yehuda in some way is the leader. Okay. Yadcha ba'oref oivecha, your hand is against the neck of your enemy. Yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha, and you will be bowed to by the children of your father. Ultimately, the acknowledgement and the rule and the leadership is going to go to Yehuda. That's stated already, number one. Okay. Now, take a look at verse 2. Again, I didn't translate these because we're not going to focus on them. But the second verse has another famous reference concerning our view of Yehuda, which is very famous. Gur Aryeh Yehuda, Miterev B'ni Alita, that you are a lion. Starts off as a lion cub, and then it goes on. Karavatz Aryeh, you crouch ready to pounce like a lion. Uchalavi miyakimun, and Lavi also isn't. So we've got three different terms for lions in this. We have the word gur, we have Aryeh twice, and then we have Lavi. Lavi quite often is used to refer to a female lion. Remember when Medinat Israel was going to make a jet fighter named the Lavi, and that was sort of, they said it was a lioness, but okay. But here it's used to refer to Yehuda, and this, of course, is the famous, is the famous reference to Yehuda being a lion. The lion of Israel is Yehuda, and this. I don't know how to express this. Generally, a lot of commentaries, especially the Lubavitch Rebbe, didn't like Jewish kids to have non-kosher animals as toys. The Rebbe came out very much against Mickey Mouse or Minnie Mouse. He says, because they're shrutzim, they're disgusting. According to the Torah, they're disgusting vermin, right? You shouldn't do that. and he said you shouldn't have, like piggy banks, and you shouldn't have anything. He said one of the exceptions to the only non-kosher, I think the only non-kosher animal, he says it's permitted to give to your children as or grandchildren, in our cases, would be a lion. He said, we say nice things about lions. So even though we might be afraid of them, that would be a permitted gift for. I haven't always followed this position of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but it's just interesting. In other words, lions have a special place in Jewish tradition, and it's one of the few animals that you might see in statue form in a shul. Many times next to the top of an Aron Kodesh, you'll see carved lions. You may see pictures if they have, like the symbols of the Shvatim. You'll see a wolf, for Binyamin. You'll see a deer for what was the deer? Was it Yisachar was the deer? But anyways, whoever was the deer. So you see pictures, but the only animal that you might ever see carved 3D in a shul will be a lion, and it's basically from this verse. That this verse is what allowed us to see the lion as this positive symbol within Judaism. Now comes the pasuk we're going to spend the rest of the evening on, and I did put a translation, although this is a very, as you'll see in about 5 minutes, a very difficult pasuk to translate. Lo yasur shevet me Yehuda. That's the easy part. That shevet, which stands for a staff or a symbol of power, a scepter, is the translation in front of me right here, which is a fine translation. The scepter, I'm looking at other translations in front of me just to see what they have here. The scepter, all the translations in front of me, I have Professor Alter from University of California in Berkeley, and I have Aryeh Kaplan, Oliver Shalom. Those translations in front of me. They also say scepter. So shevet is a stick symbolizing power, a scepter, okay? So the scepter, power, and the symbols of power, lo yasur me Yehuda, will never depart, never go away from Yehuda. Phrase one. Next phrase, not so simple. Umechokek mi bein raglov. We're not really sure what mechokek means. The translation here says a ruler's staff. So there's two different kinds of staffs, of scepters of power. Bigger ones, a shevet, and a mechokek, a smaller one. That's this translation, okay, which is JPS. Following in this idea, that saying it differently, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor legislation. This is Rabbi Kaplan, Oliver Shalom, and he said, and that mechokek comes from the word chok, a law. A mechokek is a lawgiver. This is a famous rabbinic position we're going to see in a few minutes. So not only will rulership not depart from Yehuda, but judicial power as legislators and deciders of Jewish law will not depart from them either. And Professor Alter, the scepter shall not pass from Yehuda, nor the mace from between his legs. That the sense here is, again, he's saying it's a different kind of symbol of power and authority, okay? A mace is a weapon. Okay. So far, first half of the pasuk. Second half of the pasuk, even harder than the first half. Ad ki yavo Shiloh. So in other words, this power, two different kinds of power, are not going to depart from Yehuda until something happens. and that something is called until Shiloh Yavo will come. Boy, are we going to see different opinions for what this means. The translations in front of me. This is again Rabbi Kaplan of Shalom. Nations will submit to him. Very different. Ki yavo Shiloh means that nations will submit, that Shiloh is an act of submission. We're going to see a lot of translations for Shiloh coming up, and that tribute to him may come. That according to Professor Alter, the word Shiloh comes from the Semitic, Arabic, and Aramaic root shai, which is a gift. Tribute. People will pay him because they acknowledge his rulership. But we really don't know what this means. Most commentaries, neither of the three translations, or two of the three translations, this one says it, but a lot of other translations say that Shiloh means the town of Shiloh. Shiloh is mentioned many times in Nevi'im as the place where the Mishkan, the portable, I shouldn't say portable, the semi-permanent temple was placed in Shiloh. It's a great place to visit. It's a beautiful archaeological site. If you've never been there, I suggest strongly it's worth the trip to the Shomron to see it. And it was a small town that housed not the movable Mishkan or portable temple from the desert, but it took some of the parts of the desert, the Aron, of course, and the menorah and the shulchan, and it made stone walls, but kept the roof of hides of different animals to protect it from the weather. So it was semi-permanent, and according to tradition, the Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark with the Ten Commandments, both sets, was there for, according to tradition, 400 years. Historically, it may have been a little bit less until it got moved first to Kiryat Ye'arim. First, it got captured by the Plishtim. When they returned it, it went to a place called Kiryat Ye'arim. I feel like asking people if you know where Kiryat Ye'arim is. Kiryat Ye'arim is Telstone. So that's where the Mishkan was for a generation until David HaMelech moved the Aron Kodesh to Yerushalayim. So it was on the, Kvish Echad, the main Tel Aviv Jerusalem highway, for a generation until David HaMelech brought it to Yerushalayim. Okay, but it was in Shiloh for all of those years. So is Shiloh a term for gifts or tribute or acknowledgement, or is there reference to the location, that place up there in the Shomron, that was in the tribal portion of Ephraim? Okay, we're going to come back to that. And then the last phrase, V'lo yikat amim, and to him nations will yikat. We're not sure what yikat means. Here the translation says, obey him. Rabbi Kaplan Oliver Shalom says, submit to him, which is similar. Okay, obey or submit, and submit is also Professor Alter. Okay, so we've seen, a few attempts at trying to translate, especially the second half of this verse. So we've got four issues that we're going to spend most of the time on the Shiloh, but there are four issues. What do we mean by a shevet, big stick? What do we mean by mechokek, perhaps a small stick? What do we mean by Shiloh? And what do we mean by submit, yikat hamim? So we're going to spend most of the time on Shiloh, but just understand there are a lot of moving pieces in this verse that aren't clear because it's poetry. The prophecy of blessings that Ya'akov Avinu is giving to the sons is poetry, and poetry is very hard to translate. And poetry often lends itself on purpose to multiple meanings. Okay? Bearing all that in mind, let's take a look at three commentaries very quickly together. Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Ramban, three of the most famous of the normative commentaries on the Torah. And so they give very standard approaches to what's going on in our verse, which is, Scepter shall not depart from Yehuda, even after the house of David ceases to reign. Oh, so we're going to have kings, descendants of David, from King David until the destruction of the first temple. That's the last one was Zerubbabel, who was in Babylonia. Okay. And the lawgiver from between his feet. Oh, not only will the kings come from David, but Rashi gives the famous Talmudic interpretation. This refers to the Torah scholars, the princes of the land of Israel, which means that the first half of the pasuk means that the great kings, generals, rulers will come from David, but so will the great scholars. And according to tradition, the Nasi'im, like Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and Rabbi Gamliel, that whole shalshelet, that whole group of leaders of the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael were direct descendants of David HaMelech. So that they became the legislators in that sense. And later Jewish history, the tradition is that the heads of the Jewish community in Bavel, the exilarchs, okay, the Rosh Galota, sitting in Bavel today, that's Baghdad in Iraq, that for 400 years or more, they reigned there. We believe they were also direct descendants of King David. So that this first half of the pasuk is a history of the greatness of the house of David from 1000 BCE until 1000 of the Common Era, when the position of head of the exile started to dissipate in Bavel. Okay? Very traditional approach. Then Rashi goes on, until Shiloh comes means until the Messiah will come. So the first two parts of the pasuk. The first two parts of the pasuk are talking about Jewish, for us, Jewish history. The second half of the pasuk for us, from our vantage point, is talking about the future of Judaism. That this reference to Shiloh is a reference to the future coming of the Mashiach. A midrashic interpretation is Shiloh is the same as Shiloh. It is a present unto him. Now, some commentaries said that means that the kings will take tribute, will collect taxes and gifts from people. But here it means that Rashi's saying that God is giving to Yehuda the gift of being the descendant, the ancestor of the Mashiach. Okay? That is perhaps the most popular approach to this pasuk. And so in a few minutes, in about 10, 15 minutes, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Mashiach. So we're going to come to that in a very few minutes. The Ibn Ezra says that second expression, mechokek, which I said can either mean some sort of staff or weapon, but can also mean something for a scribe, a scholar, and he says it means mechokek, it means to engrave, because the original scholars were writing in clay or in, sometimes in stone. So they're meant to engrave or to make imprints. So that's talking, again, scholars. Kings, scholars, okay? The Ramban, very famous Ramban, which I referred to 2 weeks ago a little bit when we were talking about Hanukkah, because the Ramban was very upset. We didn't read it inside, but we mentioned it. The Ramban is very upset with the Hashmonaim, and that for making themselves kings. And that's going to be mentioned here on this pasuk. In my opinion, the kings from other tribes who ruled over Israel after David, like Yeravam up north, Yeravam ben Nevat, and a whole list of kings up north, went against the wish of their father Jacob by diverting the inheritance of Yehuda to another tribe. What they did was Asur. This was also the reason for the punishment of the Hashmonaim. Ultimately, even though Mordechai, Matityahu, wrong holiday. Even though, of course, Matityahu, the Hasmonean, Hashmona'i, was a good guy, and his sons were good guys, but afterwards, their children ended up being not such nice guys, and they ended up being taking the kingship, which they shouldn't have done, because they were Kohanim and not descendants of David. So that's the reason that they ultimately all got punished. They all got killed out, who reigned during the Second Temple period. And the punishment reached the stage where eventually the rabbis, sometime after Herod, so sometimes at the beginning of the Common Era, said, anyone who says I come from the house of the Hashmonaim, that person is definitely an Eved. That eventually they came upon bad times, and the family was punished in various ways throughout history, and they disappeared. And it's very sad, because they had a period of greatness within the Jewish nation, but they squandered it eventually, and they became persona non grata. They became they became outsiders of power. Okay. The Bechor Shur is going to introduce a slight detour in our discussion of Mashiach, as you're going to see, but we'll come back. But first, we're going to do the Bechor Shur. We're going to do one commentary in the back. Then we'll focus more on the Mashiach issues. The Bechor Shur says, and you will legislate decreed commands upon others. In other words, you're going to be like the head of the court, the head of the Sanhedrin, like we said before. Upon others, meaning to say, until Shiloh comes, you will be an officer and a ruler. But when Shiloh comes, you will be a king. So there's a period when you have leadership that's more judicial and legislative, and then you become the monarch. And when the day comes for Shiloh to be destroyed, the monarchy of the house of David will sprout. So when Shiloh gets destroyed, during the time of Shmuel Hanavi, right at the beginning of the first book of Shmuel, from that point on, the leadership goes to David. Before that, toward the end of Shiloh, it goes to Shaul from the tribe of Benjamin for a short time. And then Shiloh is destroyed, and David ends up unseating Shaul. Okay? As it is written, he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. This is a quote from Psalms talking about King David. And he rejected the tent of Joseph. In other words, the Mishkan tent was in the territory of Ephraim, who was the leader of the tribes from Joseph. And he chose David and Jerusalem, which he selected. Hence, the monarchy of the house of David is dependent upon the coming day of Shiloh. Okay, so the Bechor Shur is saying that our pasuk isn't necessarily looking at any still to happen events. It's a description of a future for Yaakov and for Yehuda, but for us is ancient history. And it's not really talking about Mashiach. It's talking about the period of the kings back in the books of Shmuel and Malachim in Tanakh. A nice prediction by Ya'akov Avinu, but not anything about Jewish history. Flip the page over. I want to do the first commentary in the backside, who's going to agree with this interpretation of the Bechor Shur. And this is Rav Meidan. Rav Meidan was an interesting, fabulous fellow who was one of the Rosh Yeshivas at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and not only a great scholar, but really a wonderful human being. I had the honor of serving in the army with him. There are many interpretations of this difficult verse. That's an understatement, but okay. We will mention only our own proposal. Yehuda's leadership over his brothers will find expression only until the Shekhinah arrives at Shiloh. Once it becomes permanently attached to the Mishkan in Shiloh, God will rule as king over all of the tribes equally, showing no preference for Yehuda's leadership. So that's true. From the time that Yehoshua sets up the Mishkan, puts the Aron Kodesh in Shiloh, from that time until Shiloh falls during the time of Shmuel, a number of centuries, a minimum of 2 centuries, as many as 4, Yehuda had no greater role in the nation than anybody else. Okay? Showing no preference to his leadership, as many prophets speak about that day in the future when God will rule as king, and there will be no need for a king of flesh and blood. The person that said that, besides Shmuel said it, that only God is king, but the person that during the period of Shiloh made a big point of that was the prophet Gideon, that the Jews wanted to give Gideon, the kingship after he beat back our enemies from Ammon. When that happened, they said, "Let's you be king." And he said, "No, the only king for Israel is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem is our only king. Hashem yimloch la'olam ve'ed." And he refused to become king. And what Rav Meidan is saying is that he was right. That if it had happened that the system of the judges had succeeded and they brought peace, tranquility, and eventually prosperity to Eretz Yisrael, if they hadn't lost out to enemies, especially the Philistines, the Plishtim, if they had succeeded in making a successful nation out of these 12 tribes, we never would have had a king. The need to bring a king was because the whole system of the judges ultimately failed. The failure of the judges necessitated the destruction of Shiloh and the institution of the monarchy. And according to Rav Meidan, that's what our pasuk is talking about. Our pasuk is not talking about anything that hasn't yet happened. It's describing events that took place in the book of Shoftim and into the book of Shmuel. An interesting approach, and there's a lot. I think there's, as a historian, I really love this approach, and it makes a lot of sense. But it is not the popular approach to this pasuk. People don't want to hear about what happened. People want to hear about what's going to happen. And that's how most commentaries are really going to interpret this. I'm just going to do another couple of lines in Rabbi Meidan. We're almost done there. It is Shiloh that Yaakov sees as the end of days in his prophecy. He thinks that's the end of what he's got to predict. Yaakov does not see in his prophecy Jerusalem and the development of the monarchy under Yehuda. Perhaps this is the version of the end that was concealed from him. So he says, I'm going to tell you what happens at the end, and then he doesn't say it But maybe he really did tell them what happened at the end of his prophecy, which only went until about the year, 1050 BCE. A fascinating approach. But let's go back to the front of the page and do the much more popular approaches. And I want to now go to the Drashot Haran. So the Ran, who's bringing in powerfully, the Ran, Rabbi Natan, was one of the Rishonim, one of the great scholars from the late Middle Ages. This refers to the time of our Messiah, as Onkelos translated it. Forever until Mashiach comes, to whom the kingdom belongs, and to whom the peoples will give obedience. This means the staff shall not depart from Yehuda to one of his other brothers. For so long as there is rule in Israel, Yehuda will be the ruler until the coming of Mashiach. The idea is not that kingship shall never depart from Israel, for it is explicitly said, the king shall bring you and the king whom you have set over your nation. And the prophet Yaakov would not assure the Jews that they would not go into captivity. The meaning is that they will not depart from him to another as the brothers. When he says that it's never going to, that the leadership, the rule, the monarchy, the scepter will never leave Yehuda, it doesn't mean that Yehuda wouldn't fall. He did fall when the first temple was destroyed, 586 BCE. But it means that nobody else is going to be king, and until there is a Mashiach, that's the second half of the pasuk. This is the most common way of explaining the verse, and we have more to say about this. The word Shevet, Shnei Luchot Brit, bottom of the first page. The word Shevet is an allusion to King David, the first king from the tribe of Yehuda, whereas the word Shiloh, son, is the Mashiach, around whom all the nations will gather. The position of king was initially on loan to Benjamin, as apparent from the name Shaul. What does Shaul mean? Something borrowed. Now, Shaul's kingship, he was just keeping the seat warm for David. He didn't know that. But ultimately, he was only borrowing it. Oh, David, can I borrow your crown for a generation before I give it back to you? That's the way that the name Shaul is really, he was just borrowing. He was just keeping the seat warm for King David. Okay? And then, I'm in the fourth line. At the time of reinstatement of the dynasty of David will be preceded by the kingship of Joseph, since Mashiach ben Yosef will precede the arrival of the Mashiach ben David. Here we have the first reference, one of the earliest references, it's about 500 years ago, to this dual concept that there's going to be two Mashiachs. It's mentioned twice in the Gemara, but it wasn't really developed very much until the 16th century, that before the real Mashiach ben David from the tribe of Yehuda comes, there'll be a failed Mashiach from Yosef, but from the tribe of Ephraim. After the arrival of Mashiach ben David, the damage caused by the house of Joseph ever since the splitting of the kingdom under his grandson Rechavam, when Yeravam became the king in the north, will repeat. The Mashiach ben Yosef, when he comes, does not come in order to establish his own dynasty. Rather, he comes to help reestablish the Davidic dynasty. He will even sacrifice his life in order to accomplish this. The Gemara in Sukkah says that he will die before the Mashiach ben David comes. So the purpose of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to repair the damage done by the civil war, which split the Jewish nation into two kingdoms, which lasted for approximately 300 years. So this whole thing is Mashiach ben Yosef is going to cure that, remedy that, and then the Mashiach ben David will come and be the Mashiach for everybody, on and on and on. Okay. When that stage in history will have been reached, both of Joseph's dreams will have been fulfilled. His two dreams foreshadowed his reign in Egypt and his reign in the future as the Mashiach ben Yosef, respectively. In other words, the two dreams, the first one about the about the sheaves of corn, of wheat, bowing down. That was in Egypt. The second, do we have any hint of which wife of David HaMelech will the Mashiach come from? Most people think, good question, most people think it's Bathsheba and it's going to come through Shlomo. A lot of people say they don't know, but the most popular opinion is it's Bathsheba through Shlomo, that the Mashiach is going to be David, Shlomo, and then whenever to get to, and include Chizkiyahu and Zerubbabel, Tzidkiyahu, this whole group of kings will all be part of that Shoshel. Thank you. So in other words, the two dreams of Yosef, one with the brothers bowing down to the wheat, that's in Egypt. The second with the stars bowing down to his star, that is going to be the Mashiach ben Yosef sometime in the future before Mashiach ben David comes. Okay, please turn the page over. And I want to take a look at what Rev Moshe Lichtenstein, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Olav Shalom's son, also like Rev Meidan, one of the co-Rosh Yeshivas in Yeshivat Har Etzion. There is a dual element involved in the mitzvah of appointing a king. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to appoint a king. It's in chapter 17 of Devarim. Okay, and it says, "Sam tasim alecha melech." You should place a king upon yourself. But there are two parts to this mitzvah. Sam tasim, two parts. First, appointment of a sovereign who has the authority of government as the state's executive arm, a regular king. Part two, the personal election of a monarch as representative of divine action and presence upon earth. So the king is going to have two aspects. One is power, and the other is the power of Torah and law. That's why the king had to always be accompanied with a Sefer Torah. Wherever the king went, a Sefer Torah followed him. For this reason, it's possible that our pasuk means this. There's a shevet, that's regular power of a king, then mechokek, that is the king as someone who is fulfilling legal Torah laws as well. In this capacity, he is a sacral figure. I don't know why it says sacral. Why doesn't it say sacred? But okay. Sharing certain common characteristics with the Kohen. This latter role is unique to the Davidic lineage. In other words, it may not be usher for somebody else to be a king, but they can't be the same kind of king representing the divine Torah monarchy. That has to be from the house of David. So it may not have been asur for other people to be king, which would sort of let the Hasmoneans off the hook. And that's what the Rambam, Maimonides, seems to say. So only the Davidic ones both have a governmental power, but also religious, spiritual power. According to Jewish tradition, the Exilach was a direct descendant of Yehoiachim, again, a direct descendant of David. I mentioned that before. Okay. Now I'm going to take a look at two, I'd like to say friends of mine. Rabbi Riskin was my Rebbe back in YU many, many years ago, and I worked for Rabbi Riskin for 25 years, and he has an interesting comment on this issue as well. In fact, the first biblical reference to the Mashiach appears in our portion. Vayechi is quoted by almost everybody. Our verse is considered the first reference to Mashiach in Judaism. Okay. When Jacob blesses each of his 12 sons, Jacob establishes the character of Yehuda by comparing him to a lion, bestows upon him the gift and responsibility of the birthright, which is our pasuk. The scepter shall not depart from Yehuda, nor the judicial interpreter's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh shall come, and unto him shall be the ingathering of nations. Again, new translation for that last part. When it says nations will do something, we're not sure what, but here he says that means when people will come to Yerushalayim, as predicted by Zechariah in the end of his book in chapter 14. Okay. What is important for us is that we constantly strive to be worthy of the period of perfection, understanding that with each passing year, when the Mashiach is not revealed, yet another opportunity has passed us by. Indeed, the Chatam Sofer teaches that in every generation, there is an individual worthy of being king, ruler, Mashiach, but the generation must be worthy for him to be revealed. This idea is very important and very powerful. Now, when someone says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is Mashiach, it may be true. Now, it may be true that he was the person in this generation, well, he's now gone, but there's somebody else now. He was the person in that generation who, if the people were worthy of Mashiach coming, then he would have been the Mashiach. And the same thing was perhaps true when Rabbi Akiva said that Bar Kochba was the Mashiach. What he meant wasn't that he's definitely going to become Mashiach. What he meant was, this is the individual worthy of being Mashiach in our generation. What's important about what Rabbi Riskin just said? He's going to say something else, but I want to pause here for a minute. I think what's important about this is false messiahs have been a tremendous plague to the Jewish nation throughout our history. I mean, you can start with, Yeshu the Notzri, the leader of Christianity. That's also a false Messiah story. And hundreds of thousands of Jews have been killed by Christians over debates about whether or not Yeshu was Mashiach. The Bar Kokhba rebellion caused perhaps the death of 2 million Jews. The Shabtai Tzvi debacle cost perhaps 250,000 to 300,000 Jews died during that terrible period. That false messiahs are a real problem for Klal Yisrael. And I think what we get wrong, what I think the Jew on the street gets wrong, isn't that we shouldn't want Mashiach. Of course we should want Mashiach. But we shouldn't want Mashiach. Okay, bye-bye, Margaret. Good night. I'll put up the recording tomorrow. Okay. The problem with the false Mashiach situation is that it's not that person's fault per se. It means the generation wasn't worthy of being Mashiach. So in other words, if you say, I really want Mashiach, what you should really mean is, I want to make myself and as many people around me. So as we get further away from Sinai, what chance have we of the Mashiach ever coming for us? Gee, I'd like to think a good chance. I'd like to think that, I don't think we have to be perfect. I think we just have to be on a high enough madrega. If I can just quote from the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet, who was the second Gera Rebbe, he said every generation is supposed to put a new brick into a theoretical, a metaphorical brick into the walls of Jerusalem. And when enough generations have done their bit in building Yerushalayim and building the Jewish nation, then Mashiach will appear. So as we may be getting closer, but we're supposed to be the best we can. So when you say, I really want Mashiach to come, what I think Rabbi Riskin's saying, I know Rabbi Riskin says that because I've heard him say it. What he really means is that we have to be the kinds of people that unites the Jewish nation so that Mashiach can reveal himself. Because Mashiach's here, but he can't reveal himself if we aren't worthy of it. And what brings the worthiness? I hope it's love and cooperation and concern for Torah and for fellow Jews. And it's all of those things. That's what's going to not bring Mashiach. That's going to allow Mashiach to reveal himself. And Rabbi Riskin loves that position, and I like that position a lot as well. So one more point from Rabbi Riskin before we move on. However, when one is about to form a nation, a consortium of 12 or 13 tribes, which will comprise the peoplehood of Israel, the goal becomes e pluribus unum, out of many, one. As you've got 12 or 13, if you count Levi, 13 tribes, if they're striving together, then out of the many comes unum, comes one unified force. That's what was supposed to happen during the period of the judges. But it all fell apart. The individual tribes couldn't cooperate. Everybody, instead of contributing what they could to the national unity, were more concerned with focusing on the needs of their particular tribe. So what I love about this idea from Rabbi Riskin is that the thing that's going to allow Mashiach to reveal himself is going to be national unity. Rivka, my wife, says this all the time, usually when reading almost any article about politics here in Israel. Boy, are we postponing the coming of Mashiach. Oh boy. And there's a truth to that. And so that's why I really love this idea from Rabbi Riskin on the theological level. I really think that Rabbi Riskin has hit the nail on the head. Rabbi Buchwald, Ephraim Buchwald, who's the next comment on the page, was for many years the assistant rabbi for Rabbi Riskin in Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan, in New York. And he eventually left. He left after Rabbi Riskin left. Rabbi Riskin came to, but he didn't want to take over the show because he started NJOP, National Jewish Outreach Program, and he's been a leader in Jewish outreach and the Baal Tshuva movement, back to the 60s. He's been doing this for 60 years. It's amazing. And he still seems energetic. It's really remarkable. Last time I saw him a couple of years ago, he still had a lot of that energy. He's going to look at Mashiach from a different point of view. Rabbi Riskin's looking at it from the national point of view. Rabbi Buchwald's looking at it from the Mashiach point of view, which it's interesting and I think powerful and important. Jacob cries out, "The scepter of leadership shall never depart from Yehuda." Very dramatic, right? Very dramatic statement. And will always remain with him, despite the fact that Joseph is referred to as Yosef HaTzadik. In other words, the greatest of the 12 sons seems to have been Yosef. He's the one that had the dreams. He's the one that ruled Egypt. He's the one that, that saved all these people from starvation. He was just an amazing personality, right? And we call him Yosef HaTzadik. There is no such epithet for Yehuda. Because of his superhuman resistance to Mrs. Potiphar's relentless efforts to seduce him. Okay, that's just one great example of his power, but this is his spiritual power. It is not Joseph, but rather Yehuda who emerges as Israel's leader. But what happened with Yehuda? It is with Yehuda, with whom the common folks can identify, whereas Joseph is too utopian and too unrealistic. Now, he's too nice, Rabbi Buchwald, to mention the story of Tamar, because Yosef withstands all sorts of temptation. Yehuda gives in. Now, what he did was not good, but it wasn't what Yosef would have done. Yosef, it would have been adultery. It would have been chayav misa. It would have been culpable for death. What Yehuda did, two people out of wedlock. It's not a nice thing, but it's not, it's not the end of the world. And Tamar would have claimed it was a mitzvah, because in those days, Yibum could be accomplished with any member of the family. And she wanted to marry someone from her husband, her dead husband's family, with which they have children, to carry on the dead husband's name, the mitzvah of Yibum, in its pre-Torah form. It is Judah the sinner. It's too strong to call him the sinner, but the Yehuda, the one who, gave in to temptation, the one who returns to become the Baal Tshuva, from whom we can learn. It is he who can serve as the more realistic role model for mortals like ourselves, while Joseph is far too perfect. What a beautiful idea to tell people who aren't yet religious. One of the things that when I worked with NCSY, years and years ago, back in the 70s and into the 80s, a lot of people, who am I to start keeping Torah? And the fact of the matter is, you're a Baal Tshuva, which is amazing. Even a Tzaddik Gomer can't stand in the same place that a Baal Tshuva can stand. And you would have to encourage them. It's very important that our role models not be unreachable stars. Our role models have to be personalities that we can emulate. This is the problem with so many biographies of Torah giants. And we have been blessed in my lifetime with tremendous number of scholars and tzaddikim. But I don't see why all of these, this whole industry of gadol biographies has to make them perfect. My famous example is, that there were a number of biographies that Rav Moshe Feinstein, Oliver Shalom, never read newspapers. That's not true. That's not true. He read newspapers because he had to know what was going on in the world. This idea that we have to make our Torah leaders, perfection, is missing the point. We're supposed to emulate them. We can't emulate perfect characters. We can only emulate flawed characters. And the truth of the matter is, except for Yosef HaTzadik and maybe Yishai, the father of David, and Binyamin, there are three people the Gemara say never sinned. Except for those three, everybody else has sinned. So everybody's flawed, except maybe for those three. Everybody's flawed. So the idea of trying to write a biography of people and saying that there were no flaws, or there were no problems, or they didn't have to struggle with anything, it was terrible. I remember in the early 80s, maybe it was the late 70s, that a translation of a section of Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein's book, Makor Baruch, the Source of Blessing, was translated into English about his uncle, the Netziv. And they called the book My Uncle, the Netziv. And in the book, toward the beginning, he said, my uncle, the Netziv, as a child, struggled to become a Talmid Chacham. It didn't come easily to him. He had to work hard to really achieve in his Torah study. I read that and I was inspired. It encouraged me because I had the same problems. Wow, if the Netziv could overcome it, maybe I can. But what happened was they gave them out at a dinner in. They gave them out these copies of the book they put up by Archko. They at a dinner in Lakewood, and people complained. How can you say that the Netziv had trouble as a child? And so they actually sent an apology to everyone who came to the dinner, and they said, if anyone wants to give them back to us, we'll take them back, and we'll replace them with another book, which is more appropriate to our community. That's ridiculous. Of course, Rabbi Buchwald's correct. Everybody, except maybe for those three, had flaws, and so that we can emulate them. And that's very, very important. I mean, the Torah says Moshe Rabbeinu sinned. Aaron sinned. I mean, it's everybody. So this idea that we're trying to build this image of perfect tzaddikim just isn't right. And that's why we need Yehuda to be the Mashiach and not Yosef, because he is for us a good role model. We're running out of time. I just want to give one more shot. I really should have done it earlier because I wanted to really end with the idea from Rabbi Buchwald. But Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who was not only a great chemist, this is the brother of Nechama Leibovitz, he was also a fine Talmud Chacham. He quoted from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, Ad ki yavo shelo, ad sheyavo ze asher lo noad v'nochon ha'inyan. And he said that the correct translation is, Shiloh is not a place, it's not a person, it is just saying until Yehuda gets what he deserves. And it's wonderful that the person that gets what he deserves and is our hero throughout Jewish history is Yehuda, is about tshuva. Not a perfect tzaddik, but about tshuva. And for those of us who came from non-religious backgrounds, that's very inspiring, but it should be inspiring for everybody, because everybody, fails on occasion. And we want to have role models that we can emulate. Who's a greater role model than Yehuda, David, who also sinned, Shlomo, Mashiach? That's who we want to emulate. And so those are the two big messages about Mashiach. Number one, that Mashiach comes when the Jewish nation is functioning together as a whole. There is Ahavat Yisrael from Rabbi Riskin, and then from Rabbi Buchwald, this other great idea that Mashiach has to be someone we can emulate. He's about tshuva, and that is extremely important. Okay, I ended with that, but now I'm going to tell you a quick story. One time, I heard this idea from Rabbi Riskin, even though it's quoted here from our book one. And I was in YU, and somebody was trying to convince me that the Lubavitch Rebbe was the Mashiach. This is 1972, 73, a long time ago, before it was commonly said out loud. So my first reaction to him when he said it was, "Really? What was his sin?" And the guy looked at me like I just landed from Mars. But I had just learned that Mashiach is about tshuva. So there's got to be a sin, like Yehuda had a sin, and David HaMelech had a sin. So what's the Lubavitch Rebbe sin? This guy never talked to me again. But anyways, I think these dual ideas are, the pasuk is difficult, but I think these two ideas that emerge from it are very, very beautiful. Okay, thank you all very much for coming this evening. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, very welcome. Bye-bye.